Welcome to the 20th Century History Series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
World War II. World War II can in some ways be described as the classic war of the 20th century. It was a war with clear sides, a war between good and evil, between democracy and Nazism. It was a war of heroic deeds among soldiers and civilians, but it was also a war of atrocities of a hitherto untold scale, a Nazi Holocaust where self-proclaimed Übermenschen sought to destroy and eradicate an entire people. 6 million Jews were killed during the Nazi regime and World War II as the Nazis mechanized the execution and disposal of human beings in camps designed as death factories, and 34 million people lost their lives either as soldiers or civilians. Adolf Hitler, leader of the German National Socialist Party, never hid the fact that he considered the Jews the enemies of all Germans. But it was not until well into the war that the world truly understood how far this hatred had been taken. We will examine the causes, the cause, and the consequences of World War II. World War II was a world war because extensive fighting took place both in Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Naval wars were fought from the North Atlantic through the Mediterranean Sea through to the Pacific Ocean. At least 103 nations were involved, and altogether 100 million people fought in the war, which took place from September 1939 to August 1945. The sides were clearly marked. The aggressors were the Axis powers: Germany led by Adolf Hitler, Italy led by Mussolini, and Japan led by Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo. Although Japan fought its own war in the Pacific, it was part of the Axis Pact through its membership of the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 against Soviet communism and the Tripartite Pact of 1940. These three countries formed the center of the Axis, joined by countries as diverse as Romania, Hungary and Bulgaria, and Iraq and Thailand. The Allies consisted of Britain, France, the USSR and the USA. Further allied were countries as different from each other as the Union of South Africa, the Philippines, and the entire British Commonwealth. As we can see, World War II was clearly a world war. The main countries fighting it followed more or less the same pattern as in World War I. But where World War I had been a static war, fought mainly in trenches, World War II was a war of movement. Hitler's tactic of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, completely changed the way war was fought, as we shall see later on. Let us first consider the causes of World War II. Most people will immediately state that Adolf Hitler was responsible for the war, but the argument is more complex than that. Many historians believe that the fact that other powerful nations, Britain, France, the USA, or the entire League of Nations, which was established precisely to avoid war, did not deter Hitler strongly enough, and this contributed significantly to causing the war. Other historians believe that the solutions after World War I would almost inevitably lead to conflicts later on. Germany was crippled after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles Article 231 put the responsibility for starting the war solely on Germany. It was known as the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to pay reparations amounting to 6,600 million British pounds. It would have taken Germany until 1984 to pay it all. The German army was to be limited to 100,000 soldiers. There could be only 6 battleships and no air force. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate, and the mistrust of the new democratic Weimar Republic created a power vacuum. In 1923, Germany experienced a hyperinflation where most people lost all their savings. In 1929, the economic depression threatened to do the same. Hitler and the Nazis came into power in 1933 by promising to make Germany strong again. Hitler would revive the economy, guaranteeing a job for everyone, and he promised to return those Germans who were now living in foreign countries because of the lands taken away by the Treaty of Versailles to the Reich. Germany would be even bigger and stronger than before World War I, with more Lebensraum, living space, for the German population. Already in 1931, the world had seen how the League of Nations failed to act when Japan invaded Manchuria in northeast China. And in 1935, the League allowed Mussolini to annex Abyssinia, which is today known as Ethiopia. When Hitler enlarged the German army well beyond the allowed 100,000 soldiers, and in 1936 sent those soldiers into the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations did nothing. The 1935 Strisser Front, formed by Britain, France and Italy in order to contain Germany, did not come into effect. Britain and France were still recovering from World War I and were not prepared for another war. British and French Prime Ministers Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier would not be able to convince their voters that a new war was required. Instead, they sought to appease Hitler by allowing him a series of breaks from the Treaty of Versailles. They thought that by appeasing Hitler, letting him do this, war could be avoided. In 1935, Hitler reintroduced conscription to the army, and in 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland. In 1936, Hitler also openly fought with an air force in the Spanish Civil War. In March 1938, Germany and Austria made the Anschluss, the fusion of the two countries, into a single Third Reich. But the high point of appeasement in September 1938 came at the Munich Conference, where Britain and France agreed to sign over parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, to Germany without even considering the Czechs. In March 1939, Hitler took over all of Czechoslovakia, and in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II. As we can see, the discussion is valid. Hitler did indeed start World War II, but he did so after years of steadily defying the Treaty of Versailles with no repercussions from the League of Nations. Had Hitler been stopped earlier, the war might have been avoided or at least postponed until Britain and France were better prepared. The course of World War II can be described as a period of German expansion from September 1, 1939 to about winter 1942. After this, there was a time when the Axis powers were kept in check, and from July 1943 to August 1945, the Allied gradually forced back the Germans until the very last front consisted of the city limits of the German capital Berlin. In the Pacific, Japan started the war on the 7th of December 1941 and expanded their empire until June 1942, when American forces defeated the Japanese in the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway Island. After years of exhaustive battle, taking Japanese strongholds on Pacific Islands one by one, the Americans bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing the Japanese to a complete surrender. In short, the first couple of years would see both Axis powers, Germany and Japan, achieving a quick row of victories and establishing a large empire. The last couple of years were then about Allied forces fighting them back. Nazi Germany initially achieved a string of striking victories. On August 23, 1939, Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with their worst enemy, the Soviet Union. This allowed Hitler to invade Poland without the fear of a Soviet counterattack. 1 week later, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. The battle lasted 1 month. After a period known as the Phoney War, because neither the Axis nor the Allies did anything, Germany in April 1940 conquered Denmark and Norway, and in April invaded Holland, Belgium and France. France surrendered on June 24, 1940. If you imagine a map of Europe, the series of invasions can be described as a counterclockwise set of strikes towards all Germany's neighbors. The Germans achieved their victories by the use of Blitzkrieg Tactics. World War II was a war of movement, and Blitzkrieg especially so. The tactic worked by the Germans concentrating their forces in a strong column. With Stuka dive bombers clearing the first enemies, columns of tanks and motorized infantry would race forward. Crashing through enemy lines, the column would then split up in two, each turning outwards and circling back towards the front. The enemy formations would see themselves surrounded, and surprise, confusion, and fear would make many of them surrender. Blitzkrieg tactics resulted in vast numbers of prisoners of war, POWs. In the later attack on the USSR, 3 million Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. The Battle of Britain was a battle of the air lasting from August 1940 to September 1940. The Luftwaffe was supposed to take out the Royal British Air Force to prepare for a land invasion of Britain. In August, the targets were radar stations, landing strips, and munition factories, but in September, the Luftwaffe went directly for London. During the Blitz, as it was known, Londoners would use the subways as air raid shelters. The Luftwaffe had to give up. A new chain of British radar systems proved too effective in detecting German planes, and RAF fighter planes would attack them. The German planes could only stay in the air for 90 minutes and did not have fuel for battles in the air over England. At the same time, the war moved to the Atlantic Ocean. In 1939, German U-boats had successfully attacked merchant ships bringing supplies to Britain, but by 1940, the British were able to keep them away. But the Allied planes also could not fly very far, and large parts of the Atlantic Ocean were unprotected. The Battle of the Atlantic became a struggle between Allied convoys of ships defending themselves against German submarine wolf packs. From 1943, however, the Allied took control of the Atlantic Ocean. We briefly touched upon the long and arduous naval battle in the Pacific Ocean, Japan's initial invasion of Manchuria back in 1931, and its establishment of a Japanese empire after invading Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia caused great concern for the Allies, and they broke off trade relations with Japan. Japan saw this as an act of aggression. While the war in Europe waged on, America was the only country that might stop Japan. Therefore, the Japanese Navy commenced a preemptive strike on the American naval base of Pearl Harbor at Hawaii. It was a surprise attack with no declaration of war. 18 of the 92 ships, the largest ones, and 247 aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese now began taking island after island in the Pacific, expanding their empire. This went on for months while the American fleet was being rebuilt. After the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in June 1942, it would take the Americans years to retake all these little islands. They were easy to defend, and the Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender. The strategy was known as island hopping. Some of the Japanese soldiers were never found. These so-called stragglers kept hidden on the islands for decades, some of them re-emerging as late as 1960. The last straggler known so far was Teruo Nakamura, who surrendered to the Indonesian Air Force as late as 1974. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Hitler on June 22, 1941, launched the biggest invasion so far seen. 3 million Germans and Axis-men took part in Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of Russia. Blitzkrieg made the invasion incredibly swift, and by the middle of July, the German army was as far as 800 kilometers inside Russia. But it was not enough. By October, the Germans became bogged down by autumn rain and mud, soon to be followed by Russia's oldest defense weapon, Old King Winter. With temperatures of minus 38 degrees Celsius, everything froze, even the oil in the German tanks. Hitler had thought that the invasion would be over by now. The German soldiers did not have winter uniforms. Russia proved Hitler's fatal overestimation of Nazi Germany's strength. With supply lines stretching up to 1,000 kilometers, they were difficult to defend. The final blow came in the Battle of Stalingrad from July 1942 to February 1943. German and Russian soldiers fought through the harsh winter, fighting for possession over the city house by house. The German soldiers fought and fought. The Russians kept sending in more men, eventually encircling the Germans. On January 31st, 1943, General von Paulus surrendered to the Red Army. As we have seen, the Second World War started with great expansion by the Axis powers, Germany and Japan. Through Blitzkrieg tactics, Germany conquered all their European neighbors within a year. Anschluss with Austria, then Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France. Simultaneously, in the Pacific, Japan profited from their devastating surprise attack on the Americans at Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese could conquer and control most of the Pacific. But by 1942, luck changed for both aggressors. Now came the second main phase of the war, when the Axis powers were slowly driven back. At the same time as the American victories in the Coral Sea and at Midway, and the Russian victory at Stalingrad, British commander Montgomery managed to outmaneuver German Panzer General Erwin Rommel in North Africa. All fronts now began closing in on the Axis powers. In Europe, this happened particularly after the 6th of June 1944, also known as D-Day, when 156,000 men, mostly Americans, landed on beaches in Normandy on the northwest coast of France. As the Red Army fought back the German Wehrmacht from the east, the other allies did so from the west and south. In April 1945, Allied forces entered Germany and discovered that the Nazis had been fighting a second war all along, the one against the Jews. In January 1945, the Red Army had liberated the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. Now a string of concentration camps were liberated: Belsen, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and many more. About 5 million Jews were exterminated in these camps, along with 5 to 6 million enemies of the Reich. The horrors of the brutality in the camps and the blatant disregard for life, not to mention the mechanized killing of up to 20,000 people per day in Auschwitz-Birkenau, was surely the nadir, the absolute low point of European civilization. This Holocaust, meaning the cleansing fire, is the greatest atrocity in modern time. Gradually, the Germans were fought back on all sides, although they did manage one final counterattack in December 1944, creating a bulge on the front towards France. After the Battle of the Bulge, they were defeated by January 8, 1945, and could now only retreat. When Red Army soldiers reached Berlin in April 1945, all that remained of the Third Reich was that city. On the 25th of April, Adolf Hitler, fearing capture by the Red Army, killed himself along with his mistress Eva Braun in the Führerbunker in Gertrud Kolmar Street in the center of the city. On May the 8th, Germany surrendered. At the same time in the Pacific, Americans and Australians had for years taken back the Pacific Islands one by one, working their way towards Japan itself. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were captured. Iwo Jima is 1,300 kilometers from Japan, while Okinawa is only 600 kilometers away. But this gives an impression of the distances. The Japanese defended Okinawa to the end. Old planes were filled with bombs and young pilots flew them directly into Allied ships. These suicide missions were known as kamikaze, divine wind. After more than 2 months of brutal fighting, the Americans took control over Okinawa and could now launch planes against Japan itself. But Okinawa raised a new issue. The Japanese refused to surrender and be taken prisoners. They had already lost 9 men for each dead American. A conventional invasion of Japan, using conventional or regular soldiers, would likely cost the Allies about 500,000 soldiers. This was one of the reasons for new American President Harry S. Truman to make the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. After witnessing the immense destruction of these enormously powerful weapons, the Japanese surrendered. World War II was over. In conclusion, World War II truly was a world war, with extensive fighting taking place in Europe, Russia, the Mediterranean, and the Far East. It involved both land, air, and naval warfare, the last of which took place in oceans from the North Atlantic with destroyers and U-boats to the Pacific Ocean with island hopping, finally ending in planes dropping atomic bombs. In contrast to World War I, World War II was a war of movement. On both sides of the Axis, in Europe as well as the Pacific, the aggressors started the war with rapid expansion, after which the Allies slowly fought them back. Over 40 million people died, including 6 million Jews who perished in the Nazi Holocaust. When the war ended in August 1945, Europe, Russia, and much of the Pacific were in ruins. Japan in particular. We tend today to describe it as a war of good versus evil, of democracy versus fascism. But after the war, the USSR extended their influence, taking over the East and Central European countries which the Red Army had liberated from the Nazis. And when America, as the first country, dropped atomic devices against an enemy, the stage became set for the longest war in the 20th century. The new battle, that of democracy versus totalitarianism and capitalism versus planned economy, was the Cold War.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Border Run. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.